My name is Roland Pomberger. I'm a professor for waste processing technology and waste management at the Montana University Leoben, which is in Austria. And welcome. We have now 2 slots with each 3 presentations. And after finishing 3 presentations, we will make a short discussion. So let's start. First, the presentations, and we will have some time, just 1 or 2 minutes for clarification questions from the audience. So I have to invite and our first presenter. It's Mrs. Santos Silva. She's from the Research Center for Justice and Governance in Portugal, and she will give us her oral speech. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much to the organizers for including me in this important panel on responsible sourcing and innovation with such notable speakers. Today, I propose to speak to you without slides about advancing the sufficiency paradigm with digital product passports. And I propose to do so by briefly addressing 4 main points, namely circularity, innovation, sufficiency, and environment. These may be summarized into the acronym SIZE, and my hope is that within 8 minutes or less, we would all be rather convinced that size matters. Starting by circularity. Under the EU Green Deal, Europe set the objective of becoming the first climate neutral region by 2050, which led to initiatives to transform the traditionally linear production processes into circular production processes. Aimed at the promotion of sustainable production and consumption patterns, the EU adopted its first Circular Economy Action Plan in 2015, which outlined several initiatives to reduce waste, increase recycling, and promote eco-design. This plan was followed by a new circular economy package 3 years later. More recently, the European Union has encouraged the adoption of extended producer liability schemes, where producers are responsible for products until the end of their life cycle. And building on the eco-design regulation, the EU proposed a new eco-design for sustainable products regulation for even more environmentally sustainable and circular production. A circular economy is, as we know, one that is restorative and regenerative by design, and which aims to keep products, components, and materials at their highest utility and value at all times, distinguishing between technical and biological cycles. Recent circularity gap reports, however, have revealed how linear the world actually is. We only cycle less than 9% of what we use, and this leaves a massive circularity gap of over 90%. So contrary to what would be actually expected and desired, this gap is increasing over time. So the wrong kinds of records are getting broken and set here. Moreover, society breached boundaries for extraction, consuming 100 billion tons of resources. Despite the gradual transition from linear-based to circular-based, the predominant business models are still extractive and very much so. Moving forward with innovation. Circularity aims at reducing the number of resources used and optimizing their value, and innovation plays a fundamental role in driving the transition towards circularity. What if businesses could be assisted in privileging the use of more sustainable materials, increasing recycling and energy efficiency? What if consumers could be given the opportunity of knowing where the materials that the products they purchased originally come from, and where spare parts and other repair stores, official stores, are available? They can now, and at least they will be very soon. The introduction of the so-called digital product passports as one of the key regulatory tools of the eco-design for sustainable products regulation is an opportunity with a great transformative potential for the current and sustainable production and consumption models. Digital product passports are digital, machine-readable documents or identifiers associated with a specific product that contain comprehensive and reliable information about the product, such as design specifications, manufacturing process, and so on. It may also contain information on the product's environmental impact, such as its carbon footprint and the water and energy that was used in the production and transport of these products. Digital product passports may also include life cycle data from raw material extraction to end-of-life scenarios. They may include information on recycling and disposal, which is very useful for business waste management, and also include appealing features for consumers, such as, for example, links to tutorials on how to repair a certain product at home, or platforms where they can resell the product once they no longer need them. Digital product passports will become obligatory for some sectors of the industry in less than 4 years' time. They have the potential of facilitating a transition to a circular economy by giving power to consumers and businesses with the opportunity to make informed decisions regarding the most environmentally responsible choices. But more than promoting circularity, digital passports have the potential of being legal by design environmental policy tools that advance efficiency rather than affluence. And how do digital passports advance efficiency? One of the most relevant ways they promote efficiency is by preventing the phenomenon that we all know of premature obsolescence. Premature obsolescence is the intentional design or marketing strategy put in place to ensure that a product is rapidly replaced by a new product. There are several types of premature obsolescence, and the digital passport is particularly prone to fight technological and software obsolescence, where manufacturers basically introduce new technologies or features that made products unable to function long before the end of their life cycle. That is so because digital product passports allow to unveil any attempt at manipulating a product's functionality, which will certainly be a major deterrent for these to continue doing so, at least in the same terms or at the same rate. By focusing on the production of new, even though green, products, what happens is that the EU has been promoting a culture of affluence that digital product passports may help discontinue by enhancing product and product footprint awareness, by empowering consumers to make the best and the most sustainable decisions, and by promoting longevity by offering guidance on product maintenance, repair, update, and upgrade options. By encouraging informed choices, extending the life of products, and reducing waste, digital product passports contribute to the broader cultural shift towards sufficiency, a mindset focused on achieving satisfaction and well-being with less material consumption and waste generation. This brings me to my last point of my acronym SIZE. A sufficiency economy is crucial for advancing the protection of the environment because it aligns individual and collective actions with principles of sustainability, resource conservation, and resilience to environmental shocks such as floods, as we have seen last summer. It also promotes practices that encourage waste reduction, economic decoupling, and environmental awareness. So we see that sufficiency living often includes a deep respect for nature and an appreciation of the intrinsic value of ecosystems. And I argue that through the use of technology and digital passports in particular, we will be able to advance the sufficiency paradigm. Hopefully, I've been able to convince you very shortly that size matters, and I would be happy to discuss this further with you during the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Santos Silva. We will make the bigger discussion after the three presentations, but maybe there is a question of clarification from the audience. Is there some? Just I'm looking to the chat, for example, but I haven't seen it now. So is there any question of clarification? No? We will discuss it later on. Yeah. So now I want to introduce Mr. Andy Symington. He is from KPMG, Banara, from Australia, Sydney, and he is presenting the topic Rethinking Due Diligence, the need to incorporate bottom-up processes into responsible sourcing programs. Mr. Symington, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roland, and thanks to my fellow panelists and the audience. I'll just briefly explain those affiliations. So KPMG Banara is a dedicated human rights and social impact consultancy based in Australia, but we head up KPMG's global network of human rights professionals. And I'm also an affiliate of the Australian Human Rights Institute, institute based at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And so I'll just frame what I'm going to say today with a couple of slides. And so, sorry, has that moved on? Maybe Federica, you could move the slide on for me. I'm not. Okay, perfect. So what we're seeing, as we're aware, is that these days the social expectations around resources extraction, there's a climate of massively increased expectation from stakeholders in all parts of the value chain in terms of that social performance. Whether we're talking about project finance, regulators, I mean, we're seeing markets and exchanges increasingly introducing responsible sourcing requirements, reporting requirements, downstream customers increasingly asking questions of their suppliers through the supply chain, particularly in the context of renewable energy. We see Indigenous peoples, I mean, the demands, expectations of Indigenous peoples have been very present for a very long time, but we're seeing increasing societal awareness of those demands. Investors, shareholders, we're seeing shareholder activism, sustainable investment strategies, expectations of individual investors, civil society, and then the final end consumer, increasingly sustainability conscious. And so the context for what I'm going to say today is that crucially these expectations have moved beyond legal compliance. So it's requiring companies to demonstrate social performance beyond what's regulated. And so really responsible sourcing has become a critical component of demonstrating that corporate sustainability. Can we just move to the next slide, please? And so despite the fact that we've got this kind of need for a beyond compliance approach, we're also seeing that the law tends to lag behind social expectations, of course, but we're seeing significant legal developments that are developing to reflect those changing social expectations. And so we have it's 12 years ago, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that established that corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And then more recently, more specifically targeted legislation or proposed legislation. So the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive would be introducing mandatory human rights environmental due diligence. And that crucially is, it covers both the environment and human rights, but throughout the value chain. Similarly, the EU Battery Directive update requires environmental and social due diligence on batteries being sold in the EU market, and again, including verification of the source of raw materials. And we're also seeing, we've seen laws emerge in France, Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, Norway, the UK, here in Australia, that are either directly mandating human rights due diligence, or they're encouraging it by mandating reporting on human rights in general or specific elements such as modern slavery. And so this evolving legislative landscape is bringing in reporting and human rights due diligence obligations that require procuring companies to conduct deep investigation of their supply chains. And at the same time, those kind of evolving traceability requirements are imposing a significant burden on downstream customers to gain that visibility through multi-tiered supply chains right to mine site level. And the complexity of that is easily understood. And so the fact that this required traceability is going right back to mine site is producing incredible pressure on resources companies to demonstrate that social sustainability as a commercial imperative, basically. And so just, Federica, can we just move to the next slide, please? And so the UN guiding principles introduced this notion of human rights due diligence. And that use the terminology due diligence deliberately to make it comparable to other corporate due diligence processes, but crucially, it's got that focus on the risk of harm to people rather than the risk of harm to the business. And we're seeing really that the human rights due diligence process, as announced by the UN guiding principles, has become central to a lot of this legislation, but also to the expectations of downstream companies in the responsible sourcing context. And so those 4 key steps of human rights due diligence are the identification of actual potential human rights impacts that the company either causes, contributes, or is linked to, and then the development of a response to that, and the integration into kind of business as usual processes. And then importantly, that tracking of effectiveness, and then communicating both internally and externally, how these human rights risks and impacts are being identified and addressed. And so this process has become core to most leading practice responsible sourcing frameworks. But I think it's important to pause at this point and reflect, and we could just move to the next slide, Federico, please. That the UNGPs are now, they're 12 years old. So there were some gaps originally, and there's also been a shift in expectations since they're released. Shift in expectations around what the role of companies in society is. And so we could potentially criticize the UN guiding principles for taking inadequate account of certain things. There was never enough account of community agency. There's a requirement for consultation with affected stakeholders, but there's still a kind of tendency to view communities as kind of helpless victims of corporate impacts, or sort of passive objects in a way of processes. The communities are there to be impact assessed, and then it's the company that decides whether they're impacting them or not. The other critique I'd have it is that the positive, it was an important point that the UN guiding principles made, was that positive human rights impacts couldn't compensate for negative impacts, but in fact, it was important to talk more, I think, about positive impacts, because that's a crucial element of resources companies' relationship to communities, is the chance to make a positive impact on human rights. And so, but we see, the expectations have evolved to expect certain things of company-community relationships, which include, significant bottom-up agency to define the parameters of that relationship, particularly, again, between resources company and community. Potentially active community roles in actually monitoring the impact. And, we see that in the context of participatory environmental monitoring, for example. And then, an active role of the company in community development and an expectation around benefit sharing. And so what I'd say then is the key takeaway from looking at these expectations. My key conclusion is that human rights due diligence, as described by the UN guiding principles, could, in today's context, be considered inadequate to fulfill the evolving social performance expectations of stakeholders. And so I think that's kind of a crucial point, especially in the context of the evolving legislation that's mandating human rights due diligence, is that human rights due diligence, as described by the guiding principles, needs to include more to fulfill those social expectations. And so, Federico, I could just move on to the last slide. So to comply with those expectations and the emerging traceability requirements, what do we need to demonstrate here? Those kind of top-down, risk-based, responsible sourcing processes by the downstream customers, they're, in my view, unlikely to be sufficient. And so there's an increasing need, obviously, for resources companies to demonstrate that social sustainability from mine site, but that can only, in my view, be plausibly achieved by significant community involvement. And that's the sort of, you know, it's the phrase that it's easy enough to say, to bandy around. So we must have more bottom-up processes. But so what can that look like? And so collaboration is one. We're seeing in the context, for example, of lithium extraction, we're seeing downstream customers getting actively involved with the resources companies. We're seeing a partnership between those companies and also community development agencies, government, and that's the Responsible Lithium Partnership in Chile, which is still in fairly developmental stages, but it's a promising example of that kind of collaboration. Technology, Marta's referred to Passport. So, I mean, blockchain is an obvious example of how some form of bottom-up community input could be integrated into these kind of into a more bottom-up process. We're also seeing community validated assurance, for example, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, which has community perceptions as core to the validation of the mines. And then moving perhaps up in terms of, towards leading practice, then impact assessments that are actually conducted by the community, assurance processes that are actually done by the community. And this does happen in some contexts, the environmental monitoring I mentioned. It's probably more aspirational at this stage for other elements, but we talk about social license, what about a real license? And then similarly, we are seeing it in the context of mining, especially on smaller projects, a real sort of co-governance or co-design with community, particularly Indigenous communities, but really negotiating those parameters of resource projects with communities. So to conclude, we need to take a more bottom-up view of the human rights due diligence process, with community level processes providing that assurance through the downstream into the supply chain, guaranteeing that traceability that top-down risk-based processes are not really, in my view, adequately achieving. And so these types of initiatives I've mentioned on this slide appear to be key to me to achieving outcomes that are expected by stakeholders in the value chain and increasingly by emerging legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for your presentation. I want to ask the audience if there's any clarification question, if necessary, to do it now. Look at the chat. I can't see it now. Is there anybody who puts up his hands? No. Yes. Marta, you had a question.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank very much the very interesting presentation, and to say, Andy, indeed, when you refer to technology and to the use of blockchain, the digital product passports, they may use blockchain, and they might be an instrument that will be very helpful for this bottom-up community input approach. So thank you very much for mentioning it.
Oh.
Thank you, Marta. Yeah, that's great to hear.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we will go to the next, so our third presentation. Presenter is Marie-Therese Kügel, and she is from my university. Very beautiful. Yeah, she is from the chair of mining engineering at mineral economics from Montana University in Austria, and she will talk about what drives companies to resource responsibility and investigation of renewable energy manufacturers' motivations for responsible sourcing. Ms. Kügel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and hello also from my side. And thank you to WRF for the invitation to discuss the question why solar and wind OEMs implement responsible sourcing programs. a question I investigated together with my two colleagues, Katharina Gugarel from the University of Natural Resources and Life Cycle Sciences in Vienna, and Michael Hitch from University of the Fraser Valley. Let me see if I can change the slide. Perfect. First of all, why is this question even relevant? Well, I don't need to tell you any more about the urgent need for an energy transition. I think we've covered that enough over the course of this conference already. But renewable energy requires large amounts of minerals and metals. The mining, processing, refining, or even the recycling is often associated with negative environmental and social impacts, as you well know, ranging from conflicts, human rights abuses, water depletion, or environmental pollution. So next, please. Can't seem to change it. Yeah, no, one back. Exactly. So responsible sourcing is seen as a potential management approach to counteract these impacts. And a lot of work both in research and practice is being done to advance this approach. Next, please. From other sectors such as fashion or timber, we can learn more about potential drivers for responsible sourcing. Drivers are factors that motivate organizations to implement RS practices, and authors have differentiated between external drivers such as regulation or public pressure, and internal drivers, which are mainly altruistic values, that is wanting to do the right thing. Or particularly in the mineral resource supply chains, we observe the need to secure access to raw materials as an internal driver as well. Next, considering regulatory compliance, companies operating in the EU have more and more EU and member state level legislation to consider, and the implementation and effects of particularly the latest one, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, will be interesting to see. And this is one of the reasons why we decided to focus our research on the EU market. This background information was used as a basis or a frame for the coding of our research because, next please. Because what we noticed is that there might be information on the drivers from retailers or electronic manufacturers or wood processors, but we actually know very little about the motivations of wind and solar OEMs to source responsibly, which led us to our research question. Next. What drives renewable energy manufacturers to source responsibly? And next, we hypothesized that similar to the mineral resource sector, a major driver is the supply security or supply chain resilience for solar and wind OEMs. Next, please. To investigate this question, we invited renewable energy OEMs operating in Europe to participate in qualitative semi-structured interviews, which we analyzed deductively using the background information I just presented to identify key drivers and barriers for RS in the renewable energy sector. Next. Now, what did the coding of the interviews show? Firstly, the responses showed that there is a balance between external and internal drivers for RS by the participating OEMs. The main external driver are requirements by their clients in the form of sustainability awarding criteria in tenders. Additionally, the responses show that altruistic values play a more important role than in other sectors. The interviewees observed that particularly younger employees explicitly choose renewable energy manufacturers as employers because they want to drive and advance sustainability, which translates into an internal driver. Interestingly, there was a disagreement on the role of due diligence legislation. On the one hand, the company that did not have an RS approach before is now forced to investigate its supply chains, and its representatives saw the upcoming directive as the decisive driver to look into RS. On the other hand, the respondents from companies that already have RS policies, they fear that having to comply with the law will take away resources from existing initiatives that they see as more impactful. However, all respondents agreed that regulation is necessary to create a level playing field and to force the black sheep of the industry to reach a minimum level of responsibility. The opinion on the main barrier for RS efforts was unanimous. Transparency, or the lack thereof, was seen as an almost insurmountable obstacle in complex mineral supply chains. Next, please. To wrap it up, the interviews only partially confirmed our hypothesis. While secure access to raw materials can, of course, be considered as a driver for responsible sourcing by wind and solar OEMs, the more decisive driver turned out to be the access to the market in the form of pressure from clients. And compared to other sectors, a higher importance of altruistic values as an internal driver. However, while the company representatives we talked to all highlighted that the companies are beginning to be very active in their supply chains, we also noticed a lack of actual monitoring and control mechanisms. The companies seem to rely heavily on their code of conduct and the contained requirements for RS that the suppliers need to sign. Direct partnerships with more upstream suppliers are limited to a few critical minerals and are mostly still in their infancy. Next. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you, Marie-Therese, for your presentation. I would think we would start with the discussion. So no clarification. If there is a clarification, we can integrate it, into the discussion. So please feel free for questions and comments. And I will look to the audience. Is there anybody who? Okay, Tommaso Celeri. What's your question or comment?
Good morning again, colleagues, and thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Let me start by saying that this is not my usual piece of cake. I mostly work on transport, so it was very interesting to hear the perspective and the approach. I have a very general question. In the work we do, we often are in the position of supporting policymakers or policy initiatives. And again, I mostly work on transport, but I think it applies to many other sectors as well. And I wanted to hear your views of how important it is to integrate this into the policy discussion. I mean, we often see policies very oriented, and it was mentioned climate change before. There was this super strong push towards, for example, electrification of vehicles, and what I've seen that in the policy there is very little on how we source these materials and how we make sure. The first presentation was about product passport mention, which is a very important tool. The question is how difficult it is to implement, check, and be sure that this is actually representative of where the material come from and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's a very general question, and I'm sorry, maybe I'm not super clear. I'm not an expert, but I was wondering, on one side, how important it is to integrate this view into sectorial policies, and the other side, how big is the effort to implement and to be sure that we actually are sourcing our materials. And I mean, the same discussion goes for sustainable fuels, for example, and so on, in how we make sure that we make things right.
Thank you. So who wants to answer? Who wants to answer? So from it's also a question of goals and targets and how to implement it in regulations so that somebody is at rest, isn't it? No comment?
See Marie as her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Struggling to unmute myself. Maybe I can start, and my other colleagues, please jump in. But from my perspective, and from the research we've done so far, it is crucial that things like that are included in policy, just to motivate organizations that might haven't even thought about where the materials are coming from to look more into their supply chains. And at the same time, this can also provide a level that helps companies that are already more responsible compete with companies that only look at the prices when sourcing. Just as a very just as an example. But one thing that needs to come with the policies, in my opinion, is the support from policymakers. Because I think it can't just be, you need to do this and this and this to source responsibly, but companies also need support to build responsible supply chains. I mean, a company alone cannot be responsible for building supply chains to China that are transparent, that are completely sustainable and fulfill all regulatory or public requirements. So I think that there needs to be a balance between the two.
Yeah, thank you. Marta?
Yes, thank you so much. Just to perhaps provide some input here as a lawyer. In fact, in July this year, the European Commission adopted the European Sustainability Reporting Standards for use by not all companies, but by bigger companies. And I think this is a very good first step that shows that there is already some recognition by European policymakers on the need for disclosing this information on sourcing, on being transparent. So I think already some good first steps are being taken.
Andy?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tommaso. The first point I just wanted to make was to agree with what was just said about, that it's unrealistic to some extent to expect companies to solve all this by themselves, and particularly if we're talking about the allegations of forced labor in China. I mean, if that's the case, then it's effectively state sanctioned human rights abuses, and to expect, for example, a small Australian energy company to have any leverage over that issue when sourcing solar panels, it's just unrealistic. And so there's a real need for cross-sector collaboration as well as policy, but also government support for either through legislation of the kind we've seen in the USA, the Forced Labor Prevention Act, or some sort of logistical support to enable companies to tackle this together. And that may mean introducing exceptions to competition law, which stop companies sharing certain data, because it does seem also like a repetition of effort that a whole lot of companies are asking the same suppliers the same questions, and it's kind of repetitive in that way. Just the other point on the second part of your question, I do think it's a crucial challenge that blockchain, for example, needs to overcome, in that, if we're asking questions about human rights, we can't expect someone to give a truthful answer if they are actually abusing those rights. And so blockchain has to be able to get around that, because we can't rely on that okay, we can see where it's being sourced from potentially, but we can't necessarily get a true picture through blockchain of the conditions without some modifications.
Thank you. Is there any more question? I can see it now, but I have a question. It has been mentioned European taxonomy regulative. Yeah, isn't this a kind of let's say an example how it could work? Because it's on the first side, if you look at it or hear from it, it seems to be very abstract, but in the influence, yeah, I feel so. Yeah, it's really implementing down to the companies, and it will, from my point, it will influence very much. So, is this a kind of let's say example or how it could work? My question. Who wants to comment? Tommaso?
Yeah, maybe I can just start a discussion. Since we here at the EEA, we have been also involved into this EU taxonomy. It's for sure somewhere to start. It's massive, as you have probably seen, because it covers many sectors, many different big companies. My feeling is always that we should be extra careful, and I want to link again to what Andy was saying. It's a very complicated matter, and I don't think we will get it out with one silver bullet that will solve the problem. As an expert working in a specific field, my impression is that it has to trickle down to sectorial policies. So and of course there has to be a framework, and there has to be a general answer to this. But especially when going to implementation, we should have tools that allow to enforce and to be sure that things are done well. But very often what I see is that also the messaging is a bit lacking. No, I mean, again, bringing the example of transport, is now all the discussion is, yeah, we move to electric, we move to hydrogen, we move to whatever, but there is no perception from the expert in the field. What does this mean in terms of resource need, in terms of human right issues, and so on. So of course, taxonomy is a great place where to start, but I have the feeling that much more is needed. I don't know if the other colleagues shared the same feeling.
Yeah, I'm looking at the clock. My time for discussion has run out. Yeah? So thank you for this first discussion and the first three presentations. And now we will turn to the second block. And yeah, Tommaso,
I think it's me again.
You can continue. You can continue. Now it's your turn. It's about digitalization in the mobility system, challenges and opportunities. I've seen you have many slides, so you have to hurry up a bit.
I will be quick.
Yes. Okay, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Roland, and thank you very much, colleagues. As I already say, I work for the European Environment Agency, which is an EU agency. It's independent, and one of our tasks is to provide scientific backup to the work that is done in EU institutions. And I have to say that I'm an engineer by education, so I will come with some numbers. I hope you don't mind. But I will try to keep this as easy as possible. I wanted to show you a few highlights of one of the last report we have published, which is on digitalization in the mobility system. And this work has been done in collaboration with our network, which is made of two parts. We have the IONET network, which is a network of more than 38 countries and 1,500 experts that collaborate with us, bringing us the country perspective, and also our ETC network, which is a network instead of research institution that cooperate with the EEA, providing scientific support. And in particular, Transport and Mobility Leuven has been backing up this work. Yeah, you have my contact here in case you want to reach out. So again, I will keep it short, but you will see as a bit of a different perspective of what we have seen so far. I'm talking more about what are the problems and positive aspect that digitalization can bring, and I'm sure this will have an impact also on the resource topic that we have here before. So we have explored many different technologies, many different options. You will see this listed here in the slide. I will pick up some examples, but the report is pretty wide and spans from autonomous vehicles to sensors to logistic to how we can control demand and so on. So what is the problem with mobility today? Mobility is struggling to deliver significant greenhouse gas reduction, and you see this in this picture on the left. So while EU greenhouse gas emissions are going down, transport is one of the few sectors in which this is not happening, and actually they are going up. And we have also additional complexity, because here you see greenhouse gas emission, but how we account for this and what is included and what is not is bringing additional complexity to the topic. This has not happened, for example, in the recent year with pollutants that have been decreasing. And the reason is that for pollutants, we have clear technologies and after treatment system and things that can deliver. And for greenhouse gas, this is not the case. So how digitalization enter into this? The biggest issue with mobility is demand. So we have an constant increase in demand, and every time we have improvement in efficiency, we have the demand increases, and so we need more resources, more energy, and we emit more. How digitalization can cope with this? And by the way, scenarios are not comforting, because demand is projected to increase in the next 20 years. So this will increase the complexity, okay? What digitalization can bring? Digitalization is a very powerful tool or set of tools, but we need to pay attention, because it can also bring rebound effect or downsides. And you see it here, for example, this is what will happen in the UK electric system grid if we implement vehicle-to-grid technology, which is essentially a way to put in communication our electric vehicles with the grid and charge them in proper time of the day, for example, when we have a surplus of electricity production and so on. And you can see we will have a decrease in CO2 emission, which can be quite significant, up to 5%. And also, for example, implementation of autonomous transport, autonomous trucks will deliver a significant cost reduction in how we move goods around Europe and beyond. So this will bring benefit to the user, essentially, and to the companies, reducing cost. However, and now I don't know why this is not progressing anymore. Okay, it is very important to put unwanted effects in check. For example, vehicle to grid will increase our impact somewhere else, and this somewhere else is in, for example, material resource needs, and so this is where I was saying it's important to keep an integration between the things, because otherwise we do things right in one place and we mess them up somewhere else. And the other example for autonomous trucks is true that we reduce costs, but this will make road transport very cheap compared to other transport modes, and this will mean that goods will shift more towards road transport, and this is something we don't want, because road transport is more polluting and more let's say, it emits more greenhouse gas compared to other transport modes like train or sea shipping, for example. So again, it has good and bad side, and we need to be careful. And I'm almost at the end. We have seen that it's important to keep externalities into consideration, and you know, a question for Andy and for the other colleagues would be how we put I mean, it's very bad to say, but how we put a number or how we put a price, or how we quantify the impact that we have on human and mineral resources into this picture. But in transport, what is normally done, they put a price on greenhouse gas emission, they put a price on pollutant emission, they put a price on accident and congestion caused. And when you take this into account, you see that some transport modes are much more efficient or much better than others. Now we see here moving, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you can see here moving stuff by road as a much higher cost compared to moving them with train, for example. And the same goes for energy. Natural gas is much more expensive compared to wind and solar. And I will leave you with this last graph, which is kind of difficult. So let's try to focus just on this. This is the result of a study that has been done in Switzerland, in which essentially they have selected a sample of people, and they have give them fake currency to pay for their transportation service, but the price of their transportation service was not the price we are used to, but was a price that included this external cost. And what they have seen is that there was a significant reduction in the transport demand, and transport demand was much more was moving much more towards less impactful or more sustainable modes of transport. So this is a small experiment, but it was just to show that when you start integrating this consideration and putting them together, there is a way to keep things into check. And yeah, I guess this should be my last one. So if you have any questions or curiosities on the work, I would be more than glad to answer. And thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you, Tommaso. Quite interesting, many interesting charts. Is there any question of clarification? I don't see. We will discuss it later on. So we will now turn to the next presentation. Next presentation is by Mr. Robert Reinhardt. He's business and strategy consultant of the UN Environmental Program, and presentation is about eco-innovation supplement electronics. So, Robert, it's your turn.
Hi, thanks, Roland. Just checking if you can hear me well. Great for thumbs up. So many thanks for also giving me the opportunity to quickly present today what we've been working on. And Tommaso, super interesting presentation from you on what you just said. We'll check a few questions with you after when it's a turn for the Q&A. So briefly, yeah, thanks, Roland. My name is Robert, working as a sustainable business and strategy consultant at the UN Environment Program. And I will quickly present to you a few things that we found out with what we call the eco-innovation supplement for electronics. I guess I have to send it. No, I can click them myself, right? Great. Quickly about the context. So we've partnered with the World Resources Forum, so namely with Professor Dr. Sonia Valdivia, on developing the supplement for electronics. This was all developed under the global project funded by the GEF, by the Global Environment Facility, on emerging chemical policy issues of concern under SAICM. SAICM stands for the Strategic Approach for International Chemicals Management. And as you see on the screen, the project had 3 components, because the project just finalized actually a few months ago, and the supplement was developed within the chemicals and products component of the project. I think you're all aware that, of course, the EEE, the electronics sector, keeps on growing. Therefore, the demands for certain critical resources also indicated that we are also using a more complex mix of chemicals of concern, and these surely must be managed in the future. The project, of course, also contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals and had an overall budget envelope of around 8 million. Great. Quickly about eco-innovation itself, and I don't want to go on for too long because I think I'm the last presenter holding you before lunch. But eco-innovation itself is a 6-phase methodology that we developed at the UN Environment Programme. You can think of it as a sustainable business model strategy approach. So we have this manual that you see on the screen, which is a bit of a handbook that really guides you through where do I start if I really want to become more sustainable or more circular as a company. In particular, our focus here is on small to medium-sized enterprises in developing countries. So specific templates you would see here are market assessments, PESTEL templates, business model templates, strategy templates, so really a fully fledged understanding, and very similar to what the bigger consultancies out there like the KPMGs or the Accentures are doing to really understand, well, how can we really make a company more sustainable? And then related to that, we have been publishing supplements to that manual, so specific sector supplements that are normally done by implementing partners. So we recently did one, for instance, on the textile sector, and in this case, we also did one on the electronics sector by our implementing partner, the World Resources Forum, namely Sonja Verdivia. So what we really have done here, we did, first of all, we built on international public consultation, but we also did a pilot implementation in Colombia or in Latin America in general, with SMEs participating in the project. And the idea is really how we can show that chemicals of concern can be better managed and that business models can be turned more sustainable. I'm not going to spend, and I think the slide might be the format here looks a bit off, but basically eco-innovation, as I said before, is all about developing and diversifying sustainable business models that reduce your social and environmental impacts. So as you can see on the right side here, it's really based on key strategy components, namely business strategy, business models, and operations, and that are all based on a life cycle approach. So I think you're all aware of this. I don't have to go in detail here what we mean by a life cycle approach, but really thinking about the beginning of a life all the way to the end of life of a product and its impacts, while also understanding how me as a company, I am situated in the value chain in general. And this is something that really, I think, in the Global South is quite critical at the moment to build that capacity and to raise that awareness on how we can achieve that. In terms of the companies that participated in this pilot, I'm not going to go through all of them here, but 4 of them were in Colombia, 2 of them in Peru, and they were really electronics companies from diverse operations they're offering. So some of them doing the computer assembly, others like Intersys, they are repairing mobile phones or tablets. Or we also have Mabe, which produces refrigerators. So we really had quite a diverse number of SMEs participating in this pilot. And of course, also our partner WRF, they went in those countries, they went to those companies and really understood what kind of operations do they have. They did specific assessments. They made them understand what kind of impacts they have. So really a fully fledged, I would almost say, sustainability assessment of where the company stands today and what kind of improvement potential can actually happen in the future. And here on the slides, just a few things that we found out, probably most namely, and also not a surprise, energy efficiency and CO2 emissions monitoring was a high concern in all of the companies that were part of the pilot, as well as an increased management of chemicals of concern, and of course metrics for circular economy. I think we already heard some of the upcoming or already existing EU directives that are being implemented. So I think exactly in that regard, specific metrics must be developed to really understand how we can measure circularity and sustainability. And based on those hotspots, and that's also this value chain approach that I mentioned, normally the first step is defining the value chain, identifying the hotspots, and then based on those hotspots, in fact, develop specific sustainable and circular business models. They're in a nutshell really based on our understanding of circularity. So we have our own website that we call the UNEP Circularity Platform, which is, give or take, very similar to the 9R framework. So really starting with rethink all the way at the top, and recycling really being the last resort and the most linear option. And there are specific patterns that we also highlight in our manual and on our eco-innovation website. The companies did fully take that on and actually agreed to go and pursue some of those patterns. For instance, they want to really engage in further resource recovery. They're trying to really extend the product life of their current products, or they might also offer a product as a service, as the likes of Uber, Netflix. So I think that's really the trend right now in any sector, that companies are moving away from owning a product, but rather offering a service, and therefore keeping the ownership of the materials across the entire life cycle, and therefore can also better manage the resources and chemicals used. Of course, it doesn't stop here. We further we monitor how those companies are really engaging in that journey, because it doesn't really stop with the end of the project, because as we all know, sustainability is really a long-term, holistic, systematic approach. So we will surely be excited to see where those companies stand in the near future. We will also publish some success stories on our website. And yeah, you can just go have a look at it. It's unep.ecoinnovation.org, I believe, where we regularly update on what we're doing in that end. And coming to an end, sorry, I'm just going to skip. Well, if I have the time, I would also quickly talk about this, if that's okay. Okay, I see no. Okay, I think that's fine then. Just quickly, if you have a look at the supplement itself, we in fact also included a fictional company that we called Silicon Latina. And there we really tried, really with a fictional approach, how a company can move from really being not really sustainable to essentially becoming certified and really moving towards being increased circular and sustainable by, for instance, buying into the business models of having more eco-efficient electronic product that using, for instance, recycled plastic components or more energy efficient technologies. And that's something we also try to show in the supplement, that if you were an SME in the developing world or even in some of the emerging economies, but I might even say in the developed countries as well, you could follow through what we did with the with our fictional case study here. And we do hope that this is quite clear on how you can really move from we don't really know anything about sustainability towards coming the end to really understanding, well, we actually understand that it's a learning process, and we can really go step by step from understanding the macro environment, the meso environment, and then finally our micro environment. And once that understanding is clear, I think that there's also a lot of appetite and knowledge in those companies to further engage in that journey towards eco-innovation. Because let's be honest here, I think they all realize that there can be more profits, they can have a better skilled workforce, they have access to more markets, they are bulletproof for further shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic, and we all know that the supply chain disruptions will happen more frequently. So really engaging that sustainability approach and eco-innovation approach will make them bulletproof and rather proactive instead of being reactive that we have seen at times in the past. So in a nutshell, and we also want to highlight that eco-innovation indeed focuses, of course, on both the onset and downstream activities, but we found that, with those companies, they're often, and I think we all agree with this, I hope that often when we talk about the electronic sector, it's all about the end of life, all about the e-waste, all about what are we going to do with the end once those products reach the end of life. And I think the shift in the mindset that we need to get is really looking at the upstream interventions and really trying to understand how can we use less chemicals, how can we produce or design products to be repaired, to be used again, to be used in other value chains. I think also with regards to mobility, looking at batteries, similar issue there, that really to look at more upstream interventions. Then certainly we also found out the smaller the companies, the more challenging it becomes to make the resources available. But at the same time, we also see this as an opportunity, because from our experience, we believe that the tools such as eco-innovation is very valuable to SMEs, in particular in emerging economies, because it really led to, and we saw that, a mind shift really shifting the mindset of companies, and really this light bulb moment of them understanding that there's really more profit and more potential and more opportunities laying ahead if they really change the status quo of becoming more sustainable. And on that note, I thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me, and happy to take any questions. And cheers, back to you, Roland. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Very interesting. My question I always ask, is there any clarification question from the audience? I haven't seen it. So we will discuss it at the end. Now we will turn to the last presentation, but I haven't seen our presenter. Is he here? Robert Tanti Ali, are you here? Okay, I'm looking into the.
No, he's not connected. Apparently, I'm almost sure I saw him at the beginning, but yes, now he's.
Okay, maybe has some technical problems. You know, if I would suggest that we now start a discussion about the two presentations, and if Mr. Tanti Ali would join us, we will interrupt it. Is this okay for you? Okay. So we have now two presentations, two topics. The first look at it, for me, it's not too easy to find the connection between it, yeah, because the one is mobility, the other is business models of electronic industry. But maybe there are some connections. Huh? Do you see some? I've seen something about the packaging, for example, yeah? Which is very much about mobility and transport. And on the other hand, it's about part of the production and business model. But are there any other connections between our two presentations, our two topics? Andy?
Well, they always say that if you've only got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so to me, as a human rights professional, it's always going to be this sort of question. But I think, probably human rights is a connecting issue here. Tommaso, you talked about, the potential impacts on people, and we'd put this in the bracket of something like just transition, right? And so in terms of something like automation, I think, there's a need to adequately consider those negative impacts on people in that context as well. And as you say, it's very difficult to try and quantify, but I'd appreciate your reflections on that. And I suppose, Robert, what I'd just say to the eco-innovation, obviously trying to reduce negative social impact, but also I think there's an opportunity there to make that positive impact that I was referring to in that in my talk. And so just to make that point, that there's the kind of the broader human rights considerations across both of them. So thank you very much, both really interesting talks.
Robert, your comment.
Thanks, Andy. I just had a quick question to Tommaso, and many thanks for the really insightful presentation. I was wondering, and sorry for my ignorance, where do we stand with the smart grid? I mean, I'm only asking because I do actually have a background in batteries, on reusing batteries in stationary energy storage applications. So I think, as we all know, there's a massive, synergy between the automotive and energy markets who are working together for the full time ever, really. So I was wondering, do you think we're already there? Because while I fully agree with blockchain, digitalization, I'm German, looking at the German energy markets, I can already tell you we do not have smart grids. If we were to use electric vehicles today, our grid would not be stable enough to have that communication going. And then we have this target of 15 billion by 2030, which is quite ambitious as well. So I'm always wondering, how can we get there? Are we really ready already to make that transition? Sorry, I didn't want to put you on the spot. I was just wondering if you might know where we stand.
No, thank you very much. It's a very interesting question, and I also appreciate, Andy, the reflection. I mean, the more I look into this from this perspective, and I was so happy to hear from to hear yours. I think the effort has to be common, because otherwise we miss bits and pieces. And you know, I have a very different background and very different education, and as an engineer, we are often pushed to think that technology will solve everything, no? But the comment from Robert, and the question from Robert, I think is very explicative in this context, because smart grid has been something that I don't know. I was at university. I don't remember now how many years ago, and it was the topic of you know, the hot topic, and everyone was talking. And many years later, you still don't see them, or you start see. I mean, what we have seen in our report is that there are good projects out there, good examples. For example, there has been big effort here in Denmark with pilots on smart grids and vehicle to grid experimentation, but it's still not commercial at the point that new electric vehicles, not all the new electric vehicles has bidirectional charging capacity, which means that you already have a fraction of vehicles that will not be you know, compliant to the new standard that will come. But at the same time, is becoming more and more pressing, because the more you increase renewable energy penetration into the system, the more you need. I mean, for those who are not familiar, of course, renewable energy, renewable electricity is there when you have the wind or when you have the sun, and is not there when you don't have the wind and when you don't have the sun. And this is very different from thermal power plant, in which you can burn natural gas or oil at whatever hour of the day, and you always have electricity, no? And this means that you need flexibility, so you need always to match demand and supply, and this is becoming more and more difficult with high penetration of electric vehicles into the grid. And one possibility is to use vehicle to grid, which means use vehicles as big batteries to store electricity when we don't use it, at the same time not to charge them all at the same time, because what people now is doing is when you get back from the office, you plug your car, and that's the moment in which everyone is doing this, and this create a massive strain on the network. So Robert, I don't have a clear answer, but my feeling is that we are still not there, and this will require massive investment, which means not only in terms of money, but also in terms of resources. And you know, this is why I always try to bring this integration topic on the table, because very often policy is working in silo, and they just look at one angle of the problem. But you know, this energy transition is complex on many sides, and if you invest a lot of money in electric vehicles, then you will have to back up this with an electric grid that is able to support this with smart technologies that are able to manage this load, and so on and so forth. And this is true for all the solution we have, because you know, hydrogen is the other big discussion. And now I don't want to open the topic, but considerations are pretty similar.
Yeah, but thanks so much, Tommaso. That was super clear. I mean, even on hydrogen, we need the batteries to make it green. So I think, yeah, very interesting. Let's follow up bilaterally. I definitely reach out to you. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Yeah, I have a question. It's maybe it's a little bit fundamental, yeah, but you know, Tommaso, you were also talking about cost reductions. You were showing the charts that transporting is increasing and so on. Aren't the resources combined with transport, isn't it too cheap? So that we have the rebound effects. Yeah. So it's about, my question is about the rebound effects. Yeah. You know, that's one of the things we, as an engineer, also an engineer, we don't think about normally, because we have a technology that's better. We have positive effects, and at the end we have no positive effects because we have the rebound effects. So what about this?
No, Roland, I think you nailed the point. I mean, this is one of the big message of our report, but I mean, there are many highlighting this rebound effect. I think transport is a very, I mean, is a very good example for this, because as you have seen, we have, I mean, cars are more efficient and are better than they were 10 years ago, which are better than when they were 20 years ago, but emissions keeps increasing because the moment that the car is more efficient, it's cheaper for the end user, and the end user use it more, and it's a loop that is very difficult to break, and actually this is what is scaring me a bit, is because is now, you know, in transport the discussion is now we move our impact somewhere else. So electric cars will solve the problem, but it is not really into the picture what will happen to resource demand or to supply chains and so on. One of the possibility is to internalize these costs which are not internal now. But is, as you said, you know, transport. One of the problem is that transport is cheap compared to the impact it has. But of course, the moment you start saying, okay, we need to increase cost of transport. So instead of your car, instead of costing you, I don't know, 100 euro per month, it costs you 500. Then you immediately stumble into social issues, which are there because, you know, people need to move around, and there is a problem of affordability, there is a problem of social justice, and on this I fully support the consideration of Andy. I mean, social just transition is an important topic, and you need a framework there.
Yes, thank you. I've seen that Robert Tanti-Ali has joined us, so we will make his to finish all our discussion. We will try to start his presentation, and he is talking about community experiences with mining, induced compensation and resettlement in the Adansi districts of Ghana. Hello, Robert Tanti-Ali, are you here? Can you hear?
Hello.
Just
Hello.
start. We are. It's very important that you joined us and that you're.
Yes, my apologies. I was on the call. Along the line, I had some challenges.
Yeah, there are always some. Doesn't matter. Just start. Yeah. It's your turn.
Okay, so yes, this is a research we conducted in Ghana last year after visiting most mining communities across the 16 regions here in Ghana. And one of the issues that came up with our discussion in those communities were issues of resettlement and compensation. So with the support of the Third World Network, Ghana, we conducted this research in Adansi area. The Adansi area is a mining area. It's an enclave of the Ashanti region of Ghana, and also has Obuasi, which is the ancient mining city here in Ghana, and also hosts Anglo Gold Ashanti, which is a multinational mining company across the globe. The next slide, please. Okay, so multinational gold mining companies who operate in mining mineral-rich developing countries continue to profit from their activities, whilst the nexus among company profit, socio-economic and environmental outcomes in the local communities within which they operate are weak. While the multinational mining companies, small-scale mining companies, artisanal mining companies make profit, the negative impact of their operation continue to affect mining communities. Community inhabitants lose their land, they lose cultural sites, they lose their cultural identity, they lose their income earnings, sources of their income are blocked, network and social ties due to resettlement and sometimes compensation. Most of these communities are sometimes moved from their original resettlement and are taken to different places. And as a matter of fact, they lose their cultural identity. in one of the communities, for instance, they complained that they have the god that they worship in the community, but when they were resettled, they were not able to carry the god to the new resettled community. So these are some of the challenges. Community inhabitants face several challenges, which include resettlement problems, environmental degradation, and human rights abuses. The next slide. Community are shortchanged because most of the communities don't have the capacity to negotiate well when it comes to resettlement and compensation. They are always at the disadvantaged side. The laws in Ghana encourages the communities to sit down with the one who has a license to mine, in this case, multinational companies. And if you look at the capacity of multinational companies and that of the communities, you see that the communities most of the time don't have the capacity. They don't have technical know-how to negotiate for adequate and prompt compensation. To deal with some of these issues, the 1992 Constitution of Ghana, the Minerals and Mining Act 206, Act 703, the Minerals and Mining Compensation and Resettlement, the LI on Compensation and Resettlement, LI 2175, have been promulgated to address issues of fair, adequate, and timely payment of compensation claims and resettlement-related issues in mining communities. Despite these regulations, the current legal regulatory regime fails to compensate lands and for the use of common resources in most communities. Next slide. The objective of the study was to find out the dynamics at play at the community level in the processes leading to, during, and after negotiations around resettlement and compensation. This also includes identification of the actors, their roles, their powers to influence the process. So we look at the communities asking for compensation and resettlement. We look at the mining companies, we look at the state institutions, and then we find out which of them have more power in the resettlement and compensation processes. Next slide. Okay, so this is a summary of what the law says about compensation in mining communities, mining-induced compensation. Once you get a license to mine, you are supposed to notify the public within 14 days that the government has given you a license. And so those who will be affected by your operation have up to 60 days to make claims. In this case, we are looking at the communities that are closer, who are going to receive some sort of impact of your mining. If the claims are received, then there's a negotiation. The committee is set up. Committee that include that of the state institutions, the mining company, the one who is also calling for compensation will also have a representative. In the case of communities, they have reps on the committee, and they will look at the claims. Now, if there is a dispute, the claimant can go to court to seek redress. If in the court the issue is successful, then the compensation will be paid. If the case at the court is not successful, the case will be referred back to the minister who authorized the valuation team to now evaluate your claim and then pay adequate compensation for you. So this is the process that one has to go through. You start from the one who has the license, you notify the people or the communities that will be closer to where you are going to have your operations. And if you feel that you'll be affected by the operations, you have about 60 days to make your claims. And a committee is set up to look at the claims. If there are disputes, you can go to court as a claimant, or the minister can come in and resolve it. The next slide. Okay, so three separate communities in the Adanse traditional area of the Ashanti region were purposely selected. These communities are New Bidiem, Dochua, and Ahwim. New Bidiem is a community that was resettled about 25 years ago. Dochua is a community that was resettled about 12 years ago. And Ahwim is a community that is seeking resettlement due to the negative impact of mining. The study used a mixed method approach. We did a desk review, focus group discussion, key informant interviews, and then a survey. Next slide. So these are the findings. The Land Act 2020 Act 1036, the 1992 Constitution of Ghana, the Minerals and Mining Policy of Ghana, the Minerals and Mining Act 206, Act 703, the Minerals and Mining Compensation and Resettlement, LI 2175, are the key state legal regulatory networks that frameworks that guide the practice on resettlement and compensation for mining affected communities in Ghana. The Minister of Lands and Natural Resources, Resettlement, monetary committees, traditional authorities, district assemblies, and mining companies have the most power. They are the most powerful stakeholders, and they have interest to influence negotiation on resettlement and compensation process. Whilst communities, community members, local assembly members, and the Minerals Commission have less power to influence negotiation on resettlement and compensation, even though they have the most interest. Next slide. Most residents of the impacted, and this is one interesting finding that we are currently doing some advocacy around. Most residents of the impacted mining communities are unaware of the applicable laws that I mentioned in our findings. And so they are not able to, they are not aware, they have little or no understanding of the legal frameworks. Just because some of these LIs and laws are also a bit technical for them. Majority of the people in the study community have not made any effort to obtain adequate compensation and resettlement. The few who took actions have not gone beyond protests and grievance reporting meetings. There were indications of nifty and unfulfilled promises, involuntary displacement, and little or no resettlement support system to persons and families. Next slide. In conclusion, the findings of this study provide more evidence to support recent reports regarding the critical need for large-scale mining companies and subnational and national government to give attention to the ensuring that the gaps in compensation and resettlement processes of mining communities and national legislations are chose as laws that are implemented to the latter, while at the same time minimizing the social cost linked to the resettlement of the communities. Thank you very much.
Yeah, oh, thank you very much. You know, we are now at the end of our time slot, but I would think one question would be possible. So is there any question yeah, Andy, it's your turn.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Robert. That's really interesting. I just wondered if in these processes there was much consideration paid to the kind of international frameworks that have been developed, the guidelines around that, guiding principles around resettlement, or if it was all sort of domestic law focused.
All right, thank you very much. In this study, in fact, this study, we conducted this study as a result of the guideline, the mine site assessment tool from the Responsible Mining Foundation. And so we use the mine site assessment tool in all the 16 regions of Ghana. In fact, we visited most of the mining areas in the country between 2020 and 2021 with the assessment tool, talking to all the stakeholders. You know, the assessment tool has about 15 thematic areas. Resettlement is not part of the issues, but every community that we engage, resettlement and compensation came up. And that is why so basically we're looking at the laws in Ghana, and that is the first step. At the moment, we are trying to get some policy briefs and do some stakeholder engagement at the policy level. And so we didn't look at national, we didn't pay attention to most of the international conventions and laws, but we look at the laws in the country.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert, for that clarification.
Thank you. Any more question or comment? No, this is not. Thank you very much. We are at the end of our time slot of our session. Thank you to the presentators. Thank you for the presentations. Thank you for the discussion, and have a good day. Goodbye.